I'm Elisa Rose. I'm a publicist, writer, activist and a variety content creator. This is one of the strangest and craziest murder investigations you will ever hear, that involves deception, bribery, corruption, psychics, moonsticks, sex diaries, a man who thinks he's a werewolf and naked lesbians. It's beyond belief. And things that were accepted against the suspect, someone who is not neurotypical, would today not only be frowned on, but downright considered hate crime, among other forms of discrimination. After doing my video on the murder of Sophie, Toscan and Plantier as part of Crimes That Shocked Ireland, mainly using the Sky and Netflix documentaries as reference, I have become fascinated with this case. I wanted to research more into it. I am convinced that this is still an unsolved case and that Ian Bailey is innocent. Justice has not been served for either Sophie or Ian. I ask you to take a listen, and if you agree there's reasonable doubt, then please sign the petition linked. It beggars belief how incompetent the investigation was, and it's an embarrassment Ireland as a nation. If it wasn't real life, it would make for the plot of a hilarious police parody movie. But sadly it is real life, and people's lives have been destroyed, along with the life of a much cherished lady cut short. I'm using a number of sources as a commentary on all the reasons why this cold case needs to be reinvestigated. I don't want to waste time going over too much background, as most of you are familiar with the story. Sophie was a documentary maker in a seemingly precarious marriage to a very famous and well-connected movie director called Daniel. She had one son from her previous marriage. While visiting her holiday home in West Cork in 1996, she was found on the morning of December 23rd bludgeoned to death at the gate of her remote and isolated house. A witch hunt ensued and a local blow-in who was not liked very much in the locality was targeted. The DPP threw out what was flimsy circumstantial evidence twice, but due to the influence of the victim's family, France held a sham trial under a no-Napoleonic law that enabled them to try someone absent for a crime that was inflicted on a French citizen anywhere in the world. They convicted the suspect Ian Bailey of murder without any defence or even accurate information. It seemed more like a staged event to appease the family, which more appropriately could have been served as an inquest. In France, the verdict is based on whether the judge and jury feel it's true, as opposed to the more stringent reasonable doubt model here. Civilised society must be built on fact, and not emotion, hysteria or sensationalism. It's a terrible miscarriage of justice that stems back to the bungling Gardaí who botched it up many years before. Let's just remember that the law is that the onus is on the police to prove you're guilty, not the suspect to prove he's innocent. So going back to the start, there had not been a murder in that area for almost 100 years, so the local guards were way out of their depth. They didn't have a clue what to do. It took over 12 hours for a forensic team to arrive from Dublin and over 24 hours for the pathologist, by which time the head of forensics himself admits that the crime scene was not preserved and any evidence that it may have held destroyed.
Well, the first thing you do is do nothing. Protect the scene. Now, that sounds simple, and yet it is the most difficult thing. The last thing you want is any more evidence being added to a scene until it is properly examined. You don't leave fingerprints where there were no fingerprints, or you don't take fingerprints off.
The guards were bickering about whether to have the body brought to the morgue or left there overnight, whether or not the local priest could anoint the body, what the local doctor should do. It was a total mess. There were 2 wine glasses on the draining board and 2 chairs pulled close together. The bed had been occupied, but they didn't do any forensics on any of these to see if Sophie had in fact been alone. There were rumours that Sophie entertained men there at the time, and while I feel in the press Sophie's love life was scrutinised as victim shaming, how many men she did or didn't have there is of no importance. What is of importance is, did she have anyone there that night, and if so, who? It transpired that many of the men seen with her over the course of her visits there turned out to be family members, except for one, who was a man Sophie had a relationship with, but they had broken up, and he had attacked Sophie in the past.
When Sophie broke off the affair, he was devastated. Friends of Sophie told police that Bruno started sending her weird stuff through the post. Cut up pieces of his own paintings, a large screw, that he hid in the hallway of her apartment building waiting for her, then pushed her up against the wall so she couldn't breathe. And there were reports, printed in the Daily Star, that Bruno had tried to strangle her at a Paris metro station. Onlookers had had to pry his hands from her throat.
Then there was the husband, who was rumoured to be having affairs and replaced Sophie very quickly with his next wife. In fact, he never came over at all after the murder, which to me was very cold if he had any feelings for her. Perhaps he didn't want another divorce payout. These two men had alibis and were dismissed very quickly. Both were at home in France. But so was Ian at home, yet his alibi has not been accepted. Daniel really was the only one who gained by her death, and a hired execution was ruled out too quickly, mainly as they thought a hitman would not have used crude weapons like a concrete block. Or would he, if he wanted to make it look more amateurish? The fact that there was no forensics, not even a fingerprint found, sounds like someone who knew what they were doing, rather than a frenzied madman who goes around acting like a werewolf. Yes, this is the kind of innuendo the guards used to point the finger at Ian Bailey. Being a small village, the guards were used to taking petty little tittle-tattle as gospel to solve local disputes, like a goat eating into a vegetable patch or a cat getting into a house and leaving paw prints. Yes, they investigated this, as Sophie had apparently had a spat with someone over a cat and her furniture. Like, it's pathetic. They heard tales of a strange guy who lived alone with his mother, gossip that a couple of different families offered to buy the house and land cheap. Think of Bull McCabe in the field. That's the kind of thing the guards were wasting their time and resources on.
Fitzgerald and Leahy were fricking idiots. I've never met it's worse than Laurel and Hardy. If there was another one, there'd be the three frickin' Stooges.
People were snitching on people they had a feud with. Guy reported hearing what he thought was an animal howling, but then suddenly it was probably Sophie. And let's not forget the multiple statements the guards included from the local psychics.
They took statements from multiple dog owners living near Sophie who said their pets had been acting unusually on the night of the murder, as though the dogs might have sensed there was trouble afoot. One detective took a statement from a Skull teacher who freelanced as a healer and tarot card reader. The statement details how she performed a technique called a pendulum, hovering a loosely held pen over some paper with her eyes closed, and came up with the words Ian Bailey and I am Sophia, I will be with you on Sunday.
Imagine the DPP reading this drivel. It's a wonder the guards who entertained this crap weren't fired. In any other civilised country they would have been. On her visit to a castle the previous day, it was said she'd seen the White Lady there, a herald of death. It's true she had called into a neighbour and was on edge and anxious, but the neighbour doesn't actually say it was the ghost. She said Sophie wasn't specific about the source of her anxiety. Was Sophie even superstitious? She sounds like a fairly logical thinking person. And would she have even known the curse of this ghostly figure? The neighbour she called into didn't, as they were also not locals. In France, La Dame Blanche would be a white witch or a healer. Was she anxious because she feared someone wanted to harm her? And if so, then it had to be someone she knew. And she didn't know Ian Bailey, at least not that intimately. The very most that they knew each other, even if the prosecution is believed over Ian, is that they shook hands and exchanged pleasantries once. Sophie's friend came forward many years later saying Sophie had arranged to meet an Irish guy about his poetry, but forgot about such an important point until just before the French trial. How totally convenient, she recalled it then. There was a statement given that Sophie had been seen in a car with an unknown man that weekend, but it was never investigated as it didn't match the car Sophie or Ian had. But could it not have been the unknown guy's car? If it was even Sophie at all. There were tyre tracks on Sophie's lane that morning and a blue Fiesta seen driving away at great speed at 7:30 a.m. But guess what? This avenue was never explored either. Everyone was so sure Sophie had been murdered during the night, yet remnants of fruit and nuts consistent with breakfast cereal was found in her stomach, plus bread on the counter was in the middle of being cut. And to be honest, it seems more likely her boots were on and she would have opened the door or gone outside in the morning. Sophie absolutely didn't want to come to Ireland on her own and asked many people to come with her, but they were all otherwise occupied. From CCTV at the airport and information from her flight, it would appear that if she had a man with her, he hadn't travelled with her. I mean, was it even a murder at all? A theory emerged that it could have been a wild animal, like what happened in another country.
What we know is that the lights were not on in the house when people went to investigate, which leads me to believe that she may have been up in daylight on that morning. What I'm saying is that she made her way here. She came down the house, down through the winding laneway, in through this place here, and she commenced to feed the horses up here about central ways up the hillside. and it was at this point that she suffered bites to her hands and to her fingers. However, that being a painful event, she would have made an effort to protect herself, and the horses then, with fright, continued to attack her a bit more and gave some chase. She would have made her way out through the opening here, as far as here, with the horses in pursuit. And it was at this point she suffered the fatal injuries. If we move over here, it was at this point here then that she was unable to get over the gate.
It's unlikely, I think, but no more unlikely than the case being built around Ian Bailey. Let's talk about that. Ian was the local journalist and inserted himself into the story as such. When the guards noticed scratches on his hand, they said he became a prime suspect. But they didn't think this was important enough to take pictures of, and Ian claims they were from cutting down a Christmas tree and killing turkeys. Without photographic evidence, how can this be established legally? Then there's the black coat and his signature white-brimmed hat. This link all comes from the infamous Marie Farrell, and this really takes the biscuit. Marie owned a shop in Skull Village and noticed a guy wearing a long black coat observing Sophie from across the road while she was browsing in the shop. Marie says this man then followed Sophie. She saw the same man again the next morning on the road hitchhiking on her way to Cork, and then for a third time in the early hours of the night Sophie was murdered at a bridge near the lane up to Sophie's house. He was 5'8" with sallow skin, nothing at all like Ian Bailey apart from the long black coat. He was wearing a beret, and there was a huge difference between a beret and the hat that Ian wore. Plus, has anyone ever questioned why Marie is the only person in the town to have seen this man? And not only once, a whopping 3 times. Marie eventually made a statement saying it was definitely Ian Bailey. She had been out with a man who wasn't her husband that night she saw the man by the bridge. Note here that this bridge is not en route between Ian and Sophie's house. She refused to give the name of the man she was out with. Now, he was also a key witness, so why wasn't she forced into saying? Isn't this called perverting the cause of justice? And in a murder case where lives are at stake, in any other country she would have faced jail time. But oh no, it was fine to protect this man's marriage. In the Dublin court, when Ian took a case against the guards, Marie gave a false name of that man twice. At this point, wouldn't it be fair to say that this level of deception could have made Marie and her male friend suspects? Marie went on radio and gave press interviews which got more fantastical every time, even saying Ian threatened her, and one of the occasions he was actually miles away at a solicitor's office. Then suddenly one day she takes it all back and says it was all rubbish, he never threatened her, the Gardaí bribed her to identify Ian, and she had committed perjury and lied over and over in statements. One could only be astounded how she didn't go to jail for this. She's a pathological liar, and I wonder if the poor woman is not well in the head. Yet apparently a man drunk out of his mind managed to walk to her house, approximately 6 miles in total, on a winter's night, perpetrated this vicious attack while drunk, and cleaned the place so thoroughly that there was no fingerprints even found on the wine glasses. This seems the most logical explanation. Another witness crawled out from the woodwork for the French trial who said she had stayed at Ian and his partner Jules' place that Christmas, and that the black coat had been soaking, which she thought was odd given that there were no drying facilities for a heavy woolen coat. But Ian is clearly seen wearing it on a video taken on Christmas Day. The guards say they never found the coat when they searched his property, yet it's listed in the items that were forensically tested. The local detective says it was burnt in a bonfire that took place at a disputed date on Jules' property. Then he goes on to describe the investigation of the ashes. Yes, they were down on their hands and knees, sifting through the evidence with spoons.
Talking sums of £5,000 if I could make a statement stating that Ian Bailey had owned up to me to committing the murder of Sophie Plantier. Thank you.
That was Martin Graham, the local druggie, whom the Gardaí bribed with cannabis and money to try and frame Ian. But it didn't work as Martin played them.
That evening, Ian and Martin went into Skull and spent the money the detectives had given him on a nice bottle of rum and drank it together.
The West Cork podcast goes deeper into the statement from the Lefwicks than the Netflix documentary, claiming Ian knew about the murder earlier than it was officially made known to him by the newspaper. Netflix present this as hard evidence when in fact the Lefwicks were not questioned until months and months later, and they thought it was about noon that Ian told them he had to cancel calling to their home as he was reporting on a murder. But it was so long after they were not certain of the time. We know Ian legitimately knew of the murder at 1:40, so it would be hard to remember exactly a time during lunch that far back, although I'm sure news had spread way before that, as the body had been found around 10 a.m. Ian wasn't liked locally, as we hear many times throughout this podcast.
Before I met Ian Bailey, and I was convinced that that man did that. That's the end of story. And anybody else who read that article, and that's why people were so afraid of it.
There were stories that at home Ian wore a skirt, that one of his hobbies was destroying religious artefacts, that he'd howl at the moon, that once he held a full moon ceremony on a nearby beach, sitting naked in a rocking chair and reading poetry while 10 lesbians danced around him.
How did the observer know they were lesbians?
I don't know when we first saw the stick, but he always had it.
That's Delia Jackson, Ian's neighbour. When we asked her about Ian's moonstick, she knew exactly what we meant.
And he used to keep it propped up in there's a little sort of glass porch bit. That was the place it was kept.
Delia says it was more like a staff than a stick. In fact, a lot of people we spoke to described a similar staff.
He arrived in town with this, a walking stick is one thing, but this wasn't a walking stick. It was kind of a,
more like a staff,
druid's kind of like pole rather than stick.
This huge staff, like something you'd see out of the Bible, this great long stick, and this huge book under his arm.
Bill Hogan says the book was by the occultist Aleister Crowley.
I have no idea what spirituality Ian practices, if indeed any, but the Aleister Crowley book, along with some of what I'm hearing, suggests he might have been dipping into paganism. Pagans are very connected to the cycle of the moon, and most that practice witchcraft do a ritual in the full moon called drawing down the moon. They use something called anatomy or a wand, which could be a staff, hold it up to the moon and chant what I will call pagan prayers for mainstream understanding. It's not crazy, it's not sexual, it's a sacred ceremony, and no different than a priest holding up a host. I know Ian has never said this is what he was doing, but perhaps he was afraid of more judgment, which is exactly what he would have got. I also know pagans who go to certain spots and dance in a sacred circle, both dressed and undressed. It's not perverted or sexual either. But I highly doubt the 12 naked lesbian story is real. But if he was naked in nature, perhaps it was for a spiritual purpose. Those who follow Aleister Crowley are part of the Irish Order of Thelema. It's not demonic, it's ceremonial magic and would fall into some form of witchcraft similar to Wicca. Despite the stereotypes, it is a nature-based, peaceful spirituality that has nothing to do with animal or human sacrifice. Do what they will, but harm none. We have a law here protecting religious freedom, and had Ian Bailey came out as being pagan, if he in fact was, all of this nonsense should have been dismissed under this law. There is a federation for pagan rights here in Ireland, and any spiritual practices, no matter how obscure they may seem, cannot be used against you. Or maybe Ian was just drunk and pretending to be a wolf. I'm sure if people heard me in my backyard barking and yowling at my mutts, it would sound nuts too.
He's probably his own worst enemy, because he is a very extrovert type of person.
Jim Duggan is Ian's barrister. He joined his case about a year after the murder.
He doesn't and didn't do things to make himself loved within the community. He was a person who I suppose was brash in his manner. Irish people in a small community like that would have felt that he was the Sassenach as well, which means the Englishman.
He didn't actually seek to blend in. Always struck me from day one that he wanted attention on him.
Leo's partner Sally remembers Ian flitting between different identities in West Cork.
And one moment he called himself Owen whatever, the Irish to his name. And then he was the organic gardener. And the thespian and the journalist, so I think he was kind of shuffling different roles to kind of find different social circles and to be recognised.
I said to myself, what is this? This is like some hippie on an acid trip. I said, this is unbelievable. He sees himself projected very large on the stage. He is one of these attention seekers,
He came into my room where I was in his house at 4 o'clock in the morning, and he was in tears. He said, how come people like you? They don't like me. And I was like, don't want to answer.
And he woke you up to ask you?
Yeah.
And what did you say?
Difficult thing to answer. You're a 6'4" rugby player weeping by your bedside, you know. And I said, look, Ian, you know, people like you running off. He invented and reinvented himself several times. Whether the country gent to be the kind of, you know, the wine bar in Lothario, to the Celtic bars.
What do you think he was trying to do with all that?
Acceptance. I think he wanted to be accepted. I think he wanted to be loved. There was something in him that felt unloved.
And then there was Ian, 6'4" in a cream linen suit and combed back hair, standing alone by the wine and the snacks. You could say that it didn't look like he was making much of an effort to fit in, but you couldn't say that he didn't want to impress. He was glad we'd come, we chatted, and then he made his excuses with Jules and went off to the pub for a pint, taking advantage of being down in the town on a summer evening. When we drove up the main street about half an hour later, it had started to rain, but Ian was sitting it out with only his half-drunk pint for company on a bench outside a small pub on the corner. The pub opposite was heaving, but Ian knows he's not welcome there.
I'm not sure if Ian ever underwent psychiatric evaluation, but as an autistic woman, I can identify with much of this behaviour. Introvert, extrovert, no filter, acting inappropriately in social situations, self-obsessed and not liking criticism. I'm curious if it was ever considered that some of his behaviour could be linked to being on the autistic spectrum. His behaviour is certainly not neurotypical, even down to the so-called confessions, where he said things like, "I did it for a story," or "It was fine till I bashed her head in," which Ian claimed was sarcastic black humour. Distasteful indeed, but something someone with no filter might say or find funny. What I do know is that the locals should be downright ashamed of themselves for treating any human being the way they have treated him. Long before there was ever a guilty verdict in France, he was guilty to them for being different. In today's terms, it would be considered hate crime. Then there's the diary, which had sexual fantasies in it about group sex and voyeurism. You have to remember that this was back in Ireland when sex was still taboo. Homosexuality was only legal 3 years. If those diaries were looked at now, honestly, it's not much more than what you would see requested on Tinder profiles.
Pete Bilecki was pals with Ian back then. He knew Ian pissed people off, but said that Ian had a twisted sense of humour that he kind of appreciated.
You could be great fun.
You know, to set up your own news agency is amazing. To run it and succeed and make a load of dosh out of it, which is what he did, again is brilliant. And he was only in his early 20s then. He was very young. And so it was very sad. And in a way, it's a big shame he ran away.
I do feel for her family and her son who lost his mum at 15. He seems very bitter about it after all these years. Although I still find Pierre quite hard to warm to, as he comes across as very entitled and revenge-driven. He wants vengeance and doesn't seem to care about facts or even consider the possibility that it may not be Ian, which I find unbalanced and unfair. I do understand how he feels because I felt the same for a number of years after my son died. I saw the hospital who neglected his duty of care as murderers. I wanted any medical professional who ever had contact with him to suffer. You can't describe the anger and hatred within you. It's a big part of the grieving process, but eventually I did learn to let it go and move on. It was a chain of events, not one person. I was never going to prove medical negligence against one person, even though one person had the final say. I don't consider him a murderer anymore, as when you took away the emotions, there was no evidence to support intention. In his interview, Daniel chose his words carefully 2 years after Sophie died. "There's a devil in the hills of West Cork," he said. Why have they been all so assured it was not from their own land but here? Was Daniel trying to enforce that line of thought to deflect from the real truth?
There's awful problems as well, then you see, between you and the wall with a collaboration of a sighting case on the bridge. Yeah. Answer me fucking thing. I just deserve an answer after a fucking year and a half on this phone. Fuck's sake. Jesus Christ almighty, you know, something just fucking just... I can't hear you, man. For Jesus' sake, buddy, you're freaking...
That's the investigating guards talking to their star witness Marie Farrell. Uncouth and vulgar, and not in the least bit professional. Imagine including a statement from a psychic who heard from beyond the grave that it was Ian Bailey, but the spirit got her name wrong and said Sophia, not even Sophie. Ian may not have been pagan and the moonstick enchanting nonsense, but the truth is that this can be part of a pagan religion, or more accurately, spirituality, and to think that practicing it could be used as questionable behaviour to implicate someone in a murder is discrimination. Before you slut-shame Ian's sex diary, think back. Did you sneak into the video shop back then and get a blue movie from under the counter? Or look at you all with Pornhub as one of your most frequently viewed sites? Can you cast the first stone? The mentions that he was seen wearing a skirt and had a ponytail as further proof of madness. That was taken by the Gardaí in 2021. What would it be called? Discrimination is what? Most likely more nonsense like the naked lesbians. Total cis male stereotype. Sorry to spoil the fantasy, lads, but the last place you'd find a group of lesbians is dancing or performing for a man. Remember what was said, that Ian didn't try to change or fit in. Maybe he didn't want to. Maybe he wanted to be himself. Is that such an awful crime? How hard have people who are not neurotypical struggled before there was support or acceptance? The blood from her door, the concrete block, the blood-stained gate, where are all these items? Missing, apparently. A huge iron gate vanished into thin air. I was going to say just like the Malaysian flight here. See how easily someone autistic can make a distasteful comment with no harm meant to it. There was a bottle of wine recovered near the gate, and we learned that male DNA was actually found in one of her boots. What's the deal here? Forensics have come so far since then. Why are they not being retested? Surely the state needs to exonerate itself from the shame of how this was handled. Surely for Sophie's family, for Ian, for Jules, there should be a cold case review. While you may think Ian is arrogant, self-serving, even lewd and inappropriate, that doesn't make him guilty of this crime. There are too many loose ends.